At our anniversary dinner, my husband stood up, raised his glass, and smiled like he was about to say something loving, but instead he looked straight at me and said, "To the woman who spent 10 years following orders but never learned how to be part of this family," and the table erupted in quiet laughter, while I sat there holding my fork mid-air, feeling every pair of eyes on me. And then he added, almost casually, that maybe some people were just meant to stay small no matter who they married. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't a joke. This was a public humiliation he had planned, carefully, in front of everyone who mattered to him, and I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just sat there and let the silence settle in my chest. And if you've ever felt that kind of moment where your whole world shifts in front of people who are supposed to respect you, then gently tap like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, along with your local time. Only if this story truly resonates with you, because I promise you what happened next will stay with you. My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 42 years old, and that night was the moment everything in my marriage and everything they thought they knew about me began to change. But to understand how I ended up sitting at that table, being reduced to nothing in front of my own husband's family, you need to go back to where it all started. Before that night, I had already learned how to sit quietly at their table, how to smile at the right moments, how to let certain comments pass without reacting. Because from the very beginning of my marriage to Daniel, his family had made it clear that I was not what they had expected, not what they had wanted. I still remember the first dinner I attended at his parents' house 10 years ago, the long polished table, the crystal glasses, the way his mother Margaret looked at me from head to toe before offering a polite smile that never reached her eyes, and the way his father Edward asked me what I did for a living, not out of curiosity, but as if he was measuring something invisible. And when I told him I served in the military, he nodded slowly and said, "That must be structured," like it was a limitation instead of a responsibility. And Daniel, back then, squeezed my hand under the table as if to say it did not matter, as if he was on my side, and I believed him. I truly did, because in those early years, he was different when we were alone. He listened, he respected my work, he told me he admired my discipline, my sense of duty. But things began to shift gradually, so slowly that I almost did not notice it at first. The comments became more frequent, more pointed. His family would talk about business deals, investments, properties, numbers that filled the room with a kind of quiet pride. And then someone would glance at me and ask if I had ever considered doing something more flexible, something that would allow me to be present in the family. And I would smile and say I loved what I did, because I did, even when it meant long hours, even when it meant being away for weeks at a time, because my work was not just a job, it was a commitment, something I had earned through years of training, discipline, and sacrifice. But to them, it was something small, something replaceable, something they could not measure in dollars. And Daniel, instead of correcting them, started to stay quiet, at first just listening, then eventually agreeing in subtle ways, small nods, small comments, nothing direct, but enough for me to feel the distance growing between us. I remember one evening about 3 years into our marriage, we were driving back from a family gathering, and his mother had spent most of the night talking about how a real wife should support her husband's social standing. And I asked Daniel if he agreed with her, and he did not answer right away. He just kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, and then he said, "They just have a different way of seeing things." And that was the first time I felt something shift in my chest, something quiet but heavy, because it was not just about them anymore. It was about him. Over time, I adapted. I learned when to speak and when to stay silent. I learned how to sit through dinners where I was present but never truly included, where conversations would flow around me like I was part of the furniture, and Daniel would laugh with them, share stories, make plans, and occasionally glance at me like I was supposed to understand my place without it being said out loud. And still, I stayed, because I believed in the life we were building. I believed in the version of him that still showed up in private moments, the one who would ask about my day, who would rest his head against mine after a long evening, who would tell me things would get better, that his family would eventually accept me, but acceptance never came. Instead, it turned into something else, something colder, something more deliberate. And by the time we reached that anniversary dinner, I already knew the pattern. I already knew the looks, the pauses, the way conversations would shift, just enough to remind me that I was different. But what I did not know, what I did not see coming, was just how far Daniel was willing to go to make that difference visible to everyone in that room. That night, everything followed a pattern I had seen before, but sharper, more deliberate. Like every word had been rehearsed in advance, the dining room was filled with soft golden light, the long table set with polished silverware and crystal glasses, the kind of setting that looked perfect from the outside, the kind people admired. But I noticed the small things the moment I walked in. The way Margaret's smile paused just a second too long when she saw me, the way Edward nodded without actually greeting me, and the way Daniel did not reach for my hand like he used to. He simply gestured toward my seat as if I were a guest. Instead of his wife, I sat down, smoothing my dress instinctively, placing my hands neatly in my lap, listening as conversations began to flow around me. Business updates, new investments, numbers, always numbers. Voices overlapping in a rhythm I had grown used to, and every now and then someone would glance in my direction, not to include me, but to acknowledge my presence just enough to remind me I was there. I stayed quiet, responding politely when spoken to, keeping my tone even, my posture steady, because that was what I had learned to do. Maintain control, observe, wait. Dinner was served, plates placed in front of us, the sound of utensils lightly tapping against porcelain, and for a while, it almost felt manageable, until Daniel cleared his throat and leaned back slightly in his chair. I felt it before he even spoke, that subtle shift in the room, conversations slowing, attention turning toward him, and then he smiled, not at me, but at the others, as if I were not part of the moment he was about to create. "You know," he began casually, swirling the wine in his glass, "I have always admired people who know their place." A few soft chuckles followed, polite, uncertain, and I kept my eyes on my plate, not reacting, not yet, he continued, saying some people build empires, some people expand families, and others simply follow instructions, his voice calm, measured, almost thoughtful, and then he glanced at me, just for a second, long enough for everyone else to follow his gaze. The room grew quieter, not silent, but close enough that every word carried weight. Margaret leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the table, watching me with that same expression she had worn for years, a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Edward took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes shifting between Daniel and me, as if waiting to see how far this would go, and then Daniel set his glass down, the soft sound against the table cutting through the tension. "Rachel has always been very disciplined," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But discipline is not the same as understanding how things work in this world." Someone across the table laughed a little louder this time, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of my napkin, just enough for me to notice, not enough for anyone else to see. I did not look up. I did not interrupt. I let him continue, because something inside me was already shifting, not breaking, just settling into a kind of stillness, the kind that comes right before something changes. And then Margaret added softly, almost like a gentle observation, that some roles were meant to support, not to lead, her voice smooth, controlled, and a few heads nodded in agreement. I could feel the weight of their attention now, fully on me, waiting, expecting a reaction, an explanation, something, anything, but I gave them nothing. I simply lifted my glass, took a small sip of water, and placed it back down with steady hands, and that was when Daniel leaned forward slightly, his tone lowering just enough to draw everyone in, as if he was about to say something more personal, something final. And in that moment, I realized this was not just another dinner. This was something else entirely, something he had planned to unfold step by step, in front of every witness he cared about. And I sat there, completely still, knowing that whatever came next was meant to define me in that room, unless something changed. Daniel let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone lean in before he spoke again, his voice lower now, more controlled, as if what he was about to say mattered more than everything before, and he said that for years he had tried to make things work, tried to balance two very different worlds, one built on structure and rules, and another built on growth and vision. And as he spoke, I could feel the shift in the room, people straightening in their chairs, glasses slowly lowering to the table, attention narrowing to a single point, And then he said something that made the air feel heavier, that sometimes loyalty to a system can come at the cost of understanding what truly matters in a family. And I did not look at him. I did not react. But I felt every word, land, measured, intentional. And then he turned slightly toward me, not fully, just enough to make it clear who he was talking about without needing to say my name. And he added that some people confuse rank with value, that following orders does not make someone capable of leading a life outside of them. And this time, the laughter was quieter, more cautious, as if even the people at the table could sense they were crossing into something deeper, something more personal. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. Satisfied, Edward remained still, watching, always watching, and I kept my posture exactly the same. Shoulders relaxed, back straight, hands resting lightly on the table, because reacting would have given them what they wanted: confirmation, control. But I had learned something over the years, that silence, when held long enough, can shift the weight of a room, and I could feel that happening now, subtle, almost invisible, but real. Daniel picked up his glass again, swirling the wine slowly, as if considering his next words, and then he said that tonight was supposed to be a celebration, 10 years of marriage, 10 years of building something together. But sometimes, he continued, you have to be honest about what has been built, and whether it is strong enough to last. And that was the moment the room stopped. Pretending conversations had already died, but now even the small background sounds disappeared. No one moved, no one spoke, every eye fixed on us, waiting, expecting something final, something decisive, and I felt it then. Not anger, not even hurt, but a kind of clarity. The kind that comes when you realize the person across from you is no longer protecting you, but exposing you. And I lowered my gaze for just a second, not in submission, but in thought, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of my glass, grounding myself in something steady, something real. And when I looked up again, Daniel was already watching me, his expression calm, almost confident, like he believed he had control of the moment, like he believed he understood exactly how this would end. And then he set his glass down again, the sound sharper this time, more deliberate, and he said quietly that maybe it was time to admit that we were not aligned anymore, that our paths had become too different. And there it was, laid out in front of everyone without ever saying the word directly, a public unraveling disguised as a thoughtful conclusion. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, satisfied. Edward gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a decision already made, and I remained completely still, because something else had entered the room, something no one at that table had noticed yet, a presence, subtle but undeniable, just beyond the doorway, and I did not turn toward it immediately. I did not break the moment, but I felt it, the change in the air, the kind of shift you only recognize if you have been trained to notice it. And for the first time that night, something inside me settled into place, not because of what Daniel had said, but because I knew, without needing to look, that this moment was about to move in a direction none of them had planned. No one at the table noticed it at first. Not the shift in the air, not the faint sound of the door opening behind them, but I did, because I had been trained to notice changes like that, the kind most people ignore, and I kept my eyes exactly where they were, on Daniel, watching him as if nothing else had changed, while inside, everything had already begun to move. He was still speaking, still explaining in that calm, controlled tone about differences and alignment, about how some lives grow forward while others remain fixed, and I could see it in his face, the quiet confidence, the belief that he was finishing something cleanly, something final, and for a moment, I let him have that. I let the room stay focused on his words, on his version of the story, because timing matters more than people realize. And then I heard it clearly, a measured set of footsteps crossing the threshold, steady, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, the kind of steps that carry purpose, and a few people at the far end of the table began to turn slightly, confusion flickering across their faces, but they did not speak, not yet. Daniel noticed the movement too, just a small shift of his eyes, a brief distraction, and for the first time that night, his rhythm broke. Just for a second, he paused, then continued, trying to maintain control, but the moment had already changed. Margaret followed his glance, her expression tightening ever so slightly. Edward set his glass down without making a sound, his attention now moving past me, toward the entrance, and I finally allowed myself to breathe a little deeper, not visibly, just enough to steady the moment. I did not turn immediately. I did not rush to acknowledge what was happening, because I knew exactly what would come next. I had seen it before, I had lived it, and when I did shift my gaze, it was slow, controlled, almost unnoticeable, just enough to meet the eyes of the man who had just entered the room. He stood tall, posture precise, uniform immaculate, and the moment our eyes met, everything aligned without a word. He did not look at anyone else. Not Daniel, not Margaret, not Edward, only me. And then he stepped forward, each movement measured, respectful, and the room fell into a different kind of silence. Not the heavy tension from before, but something sharper, more uncertain, because now no one understood what was happening. Daniel turned fully in his chair, confusion now clear on his face, his earlier confidence fading just enough to be noticed. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but edged, the kind of question meant to reassert control. But the man did not answer him, not even a glance. He stopped beside the table, directly across from me, and for a brief second, everything held still, every breath, every movement, every expectation. And then he straightened even further and raised his hand in a precise, formal salute, directed at me, not at Daniel, not at anyone else, at me. And I did not move immediately. I let that moment sit, let the meaning settle into the room before I responded, my posture shifting just slightly as I returned the salute, controlled, exact, and the effect was immediate. I could feel it ripple through the table, the confusion turning into something else, something closer to realization. Margaret's expression froze. Edward leaned forward just slightly, his eyes narrowing, trying to process what he was seeing. And Daniel did not speak. Not right away. His mouth parted slightly, as if searching for words that did not come. And the man lowered his hand, reaching into a folder he carried, his movements deliberate, official. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the room with a clarity that cut through everything that had been said before. "Ma'am, I have orders from headquarters." And in that moment, I watched the color drain from Daniel's face, because for the first time that night, he realized there was something about me he had never truly understood, something he had chosen not to see. And now it was about to be revealed in front of everyone. The room did not explode after that moment. It did not turn into chaos. It did not need to, because silence did something louder than any reaction ever could, the kind of silence that settles deep into people, the kind that forces them to sit with what they just witnessed. And I remember standing there after the orders were read, the words still echoing in the air, formal, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. And for the first time in years, no one at that table looked at me with quiet judgment or polite dismissal. They looked at me with something else, something closer to recognition, or maybe even uncertainty. Daniel remained seated, his hands still resting on the table, but no longer steady. His eyes fixed on me, like he was trying to understand how the person he had just reduced to nothing could stand there with that level of authority. And I did not say anything right away. I did not need to, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, the same calm I had carried through every dinner, every comment, every moment where I had chosen silence over reaction. But this time it was different. Not quiet from restraint, but quiet from clarity. I told him that I had never confused rank with value, that I had simply chosen not to measure my worth in the same way they did, and I watched as those words settled into the space between us, not as an argument, but as a boundary, something firm, something final. I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I did not revisit the years of small dismissals, or the way that night had been planned to unfold at my expense, because none of that needed to be said anymore. And I realized in that moment that closure does not always come from being understood by others. Sometimes it comes from finally understanding yourself, from seeing clearly what you have been holding on to, and deciding, quietly, that it no longer belongs to you. I left that house not in anger, not in defeat, but in a kind of stillness I had not felt in a long time. And in the weeks that followed, my life did not suddenly become perfect. There were difficult conversations, legal processes, long days where everything felt uncertain. But there was also something else, something steady, A sense that I was no longer trying to fit into a space that had never truly accepted me. And that kind of freedom, even when it comes with discomfort, is still freedom. And if you are listening to this right now, maybe you have felt something similar. Maybe you have sat at a table where your voice felt smaller than it should, where your worth was quietly questioned or redefined by people who never took the time to understand you. And if that is you, I want you to know this. Your value does not disappear just because someone else refuses to see it. Your silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes it means you are choosing the right moment to step into your own truth, and that moment will come, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, and when it does, you will recognize it, because something inside you will finally feel aligned. And maybe that is where faith lives, not just in something greater than us, but in that quiet inner voice that keeps telling you to hold on, to stay grounded, to trust that what is meant for you will not require you to shrink. So take care of your boundaries, protect your peace. Make sure your decisions are not built on someone else's expectations, but on your own understanding of what a full life looks like. And do not be afraid to walk away from spaces that only see a version of you that no longer exists, because growth often requires distance, and healing often begins with a single choice to stop accepting less than what you know you deserve. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for allowing this moment to exist between us, because sometimes just being heard can make all the difference. My name is Rachel Carter. I am 42 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never let anyone define your worth in a room where you have already outgrown their understanding.